Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen Odegaard, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome to the Stop Overthinking podcast. I have an interview today with Sarah Fecht, and we are going to be talking about women in leadership and especially like emotional intelligence and how that factors in. So I have run into Sarah several times over the past several years, but most recently she spoke at a small group of female entrepreneurs that I belong to, and we talked a lot about leadership strengths and weaknesses. But of course, I was really intrigued with the exercise on emotional intelligence, or EQ, and IQ, which is the intelligence quotient, and measures our reasoning ability. And so since this podcast focuses a lot on thinking and emotions, we're going to dive into that piece. Talking about being a leader, emotional intelligence, and how to harness those skills and be your best self. So welcome, Sarah. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. I have found the sessions that you've done to be of value and hope that this one is as well. So I have branched out from leading human resources for about 20 years to starting my own company about 4 years ago with the hope of being able to pour into leaders so that they can bring their best self. And what that looks like is at the very basic level, just identifying the fact that we are all leaders. It doesn't matter what the title is that we have, the position that we hold. We all lead because leadership is about influence, and we all have influence. People are watching what we're doing, watching what we're saying. They want to know our thoughts and opinions on certain topics, and therefore we influence them even when they don't necessarily tell us that we've influenced them. And so for the past 4 years, I've focused in on providing one-on-one leadership coaching, as well as training and keynote speaking along those topics. So I had the pleasure of being with Sister Circle, which was absolutely amazing, filled with a whole bunch of leaders in the room who also happen to be female leaders.
Yes, that, and of course you have personal experience with that as well. So in terms of, I mentioned we did a kind of an exercise when you were speaking about emotional intelligence, EQ, and IQ. And tell me a little bit about why that is something that you do with talking with leaders and the importance and role that EQ and IQ have in leadership and the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about the exercise. So what I have participants do is think about a leader who has helped them to go further or helped them to go faster than they would have on their own. Typically somebody that you look up to. Again, they may not know that you look up to them, but somebody who's influenced your life in a way that when you think of that person, right? You think about those characteristics and behaviors that you look up to, that they are portrayed and that you've seen exemplified in them. And what I ask participants to do is just to write down those characteristics or behaviors that you look up to, right? Why do you look to that person? Why have they been influential in your life? And after you've written down characteristics, then I ask you to go back and identify if it relates to somebody's IQ. So, talking about their cognitive abilities, such as problem solving, logical reasoning, and memory, or if it relates to their EQ, which really is that ability to recognize, understand, and manage our emotions, both in ourselves and then in others as well. So, the EQ side involves skills like empathy, self awareness, and effective communication. And every single time I lead this exercise, the room, regardless of the makeup of the room and the demographics, it could be all female, it could be all male room, it could be from any industry, white collar, blue collar, and everything in between. It is an overwhelming response that the EQ are the characteristics and behaviors that we look up to and that we admire most in our leadership. the exercise becomes extremely powerful because it's everybody in the room collaborating, that we recognize it together at the same time. It's not about me as the lead, as the, trainer in that instance saying, oh, EQ matters most, right? Like it's everybody going, oh, we're saying, because these are the characteristics and behaviors that we value, we're saying EQ matters most. And it becomes powerful because EQ is something that we can work on. And oftentimes those characteristics and behaviors that stand out, right? Shows respect, listens, values me, makes time for me. All of those behaviors and characteristics are a choice that each of us can make every single day in how we show up for other people.
Mhm. Yes. Thank you. And it was very, very powerful for us to come and see that, intrigued with the whole emotional component of things. And I find it fascinating because that's one aspect that doesn't get taught specifically as we are growing up, or that we've really had a lot of those skills. And so it seems that sometimes like it's not important, but it really is. And it's so easy to just misconstrue the emotional, all aspects of our life.
Yeah, too often we see it getting discounted, right? We see it getting discounted when we use the term soft skills.
Yes.
Because the most ironic piece of that is that they are the hardest skills oftentimes to teach when someone doesn't want to learn them, right?
Yes.
It's available. The learnings are available. The action steps are available to get better at emotional intelligence when someone's willing to do it. But it's just ironic that we say that they're soft skills, or we discount it when we're like, oh, they're just emotional.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Or we allow somebody to apologize when they're showing emotions. Emotions are not wrong. Emotions have an appropriate place, even in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
They are appropriate for us to feel. If we don't feel them, we don't heal from them, right? Those are the ways that we heal, is by able to feel and process. And it's how we see and support each other.
Mm-hmm.
It happens through the emotional piece. And
Yeah.
we discount it when we're like, oh, they're just being emotional,
Mm-hmm.
when we apologize for it.
Right. And so in terms of like showing emotion in the workplace, is there resistance sometimes to people accepting that that's acceptable and necessary?
Yeah, I definitely still see workplaces where that it isn't acceptable. Um, it's either not acceptable because the level of the organization that you're at, right? Well, at a certain level, you shouldn't act that way. And we all have feelings, especially when we're passionate about the work that we do, which hopefully, right? We want to work in organizations where people are passionate about the work that they're doing. And when you're passionate, oftentimes feelings have a place in there. Now, the role, right, in leadership is to figure out, how do we manage that appropriately, right? Because we certainly, right, we don't want to make decisions that are purely based on feelings, because we will make the wrong decisions. We don't want to have a reaction that is only feelings based. When you talk about that we can be overwhelmed in the moment, literally we can be hijacked in a moment, because when something happens to us, we can have an emotional hijack, and our brains actually cannot think straight.
Yes.
And we can't conjure up the right thing to say. And so oftentimes, if we do speak, we blurt out something that we may later on be like, oh, I never would have handled that way if I just taken a moment to pause and reflect, and not allow my emotions to get the better of me.
Yes. In terms of some of those emotional skills and the EQ, what do you see as being the most prominent indicators for success? And what does that look like?
I see that the biggest one being having self-awareness. And self-awareness, the articles and research would suggest that we think we're all self-aware. Like an overwhelming amount of us believe that we are self-aware, and realistically, we're oftentimes not self-aware. So working on creating ways to increase our self-awareness. So for an example, in the workplace or in our lives, having trusted relationships where we say, hey, this is something that I'm working on. I'm trying to, increase this behavior or decrease this behavior. Really appreciate it if you helped me work through that. If you would, if you see me showing that behavior or not showing the behavior when appropriate, can you please just call me out on it to help me in my growth? Opening up those dialogues with, again, trusted partners. That it's not just anybody, right? We shouldn't give anybody the power to give us their input and allow it to impact us.
All right. So self-awareness, is there like a close second or third that you would put in there as well?
Another close second, I would say, is really honing in on our communication skills. So often it's not what we say that gets us in trouble, it's how we say it.
Yes.
If we're not mindful about that it's going to be a delicate conversation potentially, or recognizing when all of a sudden a conversation is turned and now it's become a critical conversation, or feelings have now been activated in a way where the conversation needs to pause, right? We need to say, you know what? I think that we both need a chance to process this and come back in an hour, come back in a day to discuss this, where we both have had time away from, can be very beneficial. So those communication skills in knowing how to handle the situations, right? Where you have somebody who is coming to you and needs you in that moment, and maybe you don't have time for it. Ouch. Right? How do we make sure that we can set aside the appropriate time, make them feel seen and heard in that moment, even if we don't have hour that they need at that exact moment.
Right. I'm curious with communication skills, because something I hear from my clients is that their intention is good. And here I am putting this forward, but it's this other person who's misinterpreting it, for example. And do you see that with clients that you work with as well? And how do you have a conversation to have the self-awareness, but in addition, also the awareness of the other person and how it might be perceived from them?
Yeah, yeah. The beauty is that we typically judge ourselves by our intentions, right? We're like, well, I'm well-intended, oh, I meant to do that, or I thought I was going to do that, or, that's not how I meant it. Like you said, right? You took it the wrong way. The reality is we don't get to choose how somebody interprets or takes in the information that we're giving. Our intention should be coming from a place of, if I am well-intended, then I'm going to consider the audience and how they might receive it, right? And how can I do everything in my power to make sure that that intent and the impact actually align? So ways to check for that alignment, right? To know that, did it have the impact that I intended? How do I gauge that? How do I ask follow-up questions to know if it hit them the same way that I intended it to happen?
How that plays out in the workplace or in leadership.
Such a great question. So I have done some research on this and found that, generally speaking, right? And right, you always have that asterisk, right?
Right.
It's general. It
Yes.
doesn't mean everybody. So generally speaking, females typically have a higher EQ overall. And generally speaking, males have a higher IQ overall, if we're to compare. So how that then plays out in the workplace can look and feel very differently, right? So for example, as we were just talking about, how do you make sure intent and impact align? Part of it is knowing where are people's natural strong suits, right? So if it is the IQ piece that somebody is highest in, then how do I speak to that piece versus if it's the EQ place that somebody is strongest in, how do I speak so that it relates and that impact is stronger in that area? So it can look and feel differently. I think that needle is changing because there's been such a heightened focus on emotional intelligence and the awareness just around that term, right?
Yes.
And making it a place of realizing that's what our actual leaders who are responsible for heartbeats in our organizations, that's what we need to be promoting on. We need to be promoting people to lead others that have that emotional intelligence piece.
And it's interesting, and I'm glad to see that change, and I appreciate that, and I think we're getting there. But I also hear from women specifically, they feel like they're being penalized in once you get to, say, middle management or above, in terms of still that stereotype, like women are too emotional, or somehow they're not tough enough to be able to handle a team of men or men underneath them. And I'm just wondering if you have encountered that and what the conversations look like around women maybe feeling like they need to push down some of the emotions at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's the piece of the regulation piece of how do you make sure that it is appropriate in the context, right? And not clearly, right? I don't know that the specific situations, right? To be able to analyze and create that self-awareness of, okay, well, were my emotions, did they get the better of me? Did I react too quickly? If somebody brings something up to me, do I immediately go into tears? No, I'm not suggesting that that is what's happening, right? And sometimes that is like the stereotype of that, oh my gosh, what if she cries in my office? Well, then she cries in your office, right? And what if he cries in the office? Well, then he cries in the office, right? Sometimes those situations need to happen and it's okay. I think there continues to, as much as the needle changes, it is very organizational and depends on the culture of the organization and that the values that they have in the organization and then how they're lived out, right? So we might say that we value people speaking up and challenging the status quo, right? That's a big one. Like, yes, we want you to challenge the status quo. And then when somebody does, right, we beat them over the head and we're like, hey, this is the way we've always done it. This is not up for discussion. Just do it the way that I told you to do it. And everybody notices when that happens, right? That's how we're sending messages in our organization of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I guess my challenge back to somebody who might say, that they're not feeling supported in their role in the organization or in their leadership development would be, maybe you're not in the right organization. Like if an organization if you're feeling like you're being held back because you're showing appropriate emotion in the workplace and you're recognizing the fact that emotions exist in us and that they are a good thing and not something that we should, try to beat out of each other,
Right.
that maybe we're not in the right organization. Maybe it's not a place that is valuing when we're bringing our best self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we all have a choice of where we spend our time, talent, and treasure. And maybe that organization doesn't serve our time, talent, and treasure. And there's a place where it more appropriate aligns.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I talk a lot about alignment with priorities and values. And I love your term with time, talent, and treasures as well, in terms of people really being able to show up authentically, but you have to know what that is. And sometimes when it's so muddled because you're not sure what really are my values, what's important to me, because they've never taken time to consciously think about it, it can be very easy to just go on to the next thing. And especially in a workforce where you just feel like I'm climbing to the next step of the ladder. And I don't want to say it's easy to lose sight, but it happens. And really being able to know yourself, get back to that self-awareness of, what's the right fit for me and what's important. Because I spend a lot of time at work, and that if we're not in alignment, that can be really uncomfortable. Yeah, for sure.
Hopefully that the women leaders that are in those places of power in organizations use that to change that stereotype, right? That still can exist, and that perception of that they do feel free to bring in emotions when appropriate and make sure that there's a balance, right? There needs to be a balance when we're decision making. It can't just be factually based, numbers driven, right? There are people in the workplace that we also need to think of and be mindful of. We have to always be recognizing the fact of our impact, right? As an organization, when we make decisions, what is the impact of that decision, right? In our organization, we may have 100 people, but guess what? They oftentimes have families and people that they're supporting. When we make a decision, it's not just the 100 people that we're impacting those families too, which impacts our community. So recognizing and creating that awareness around that, the
Yes.
importance of that and being mindful of that as we're decision making is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. I want to take a moment because not everybody has a leadership role or title, or necessarily people that report to them, whether they are a teacher or a nurse or a mom that's staying at home, but they still have influence and they still are leading other people. And so even if you don't have that title or role that with people underneath you, how can people use their influence and recognize that they have influence? What advice do you have for people in those roles?
Yeah, I think first is just give yourself the credit of knowing that you have influence, right? You have to start there, right? That's the foundation of understanding and believing that you have influence. The people that you interact with, as simple as when I walk into a store, the gas station, the grocery store, and see another person, sharing just a smile with them, right? Usually they smile back, right? You have influenced that person. You have positively impacted their day. And selfishly, right? That feels good too, to be like, oh, I don't know that person. I shared a smile or maybe a small little chatter. Maybe I held the door for them. I did something kind for somebody. It's mutually beneficial. So recognizing that, I think the statement about talking about, when have you thought about your values and been intentional about it? Because when you have the foundation of knowing that, yes, I have influence, now it becomes, well, how am I going to use that influence? And in what ways am I going to use my influence? So when you think about your values and how they might align, as well as the next challenge in that step, as I'm giving steps here, I guess, would be, what does success look like for me? So often we think of, the worldly views of what success might be, but I would argue you should throw those aside and think, if these are my values and how I want to live my life with intentionality, then I'm creating my own definition of success. And if I have my own definition of success and am working towards that, that's how I will influence the world around me. And that's how I know I'm going to influence in the way that I can look back and be proud of. Like, yes, we all make mistakes and we're going to flub it up, right? We're humans. We're all quirky, and we all have, areas where we wish we would have done something differently, said something differently, behaved differently. But if we continue to go back and stay grounded in what our values are that support us in how we define success, we will have that growth and intentionality to feel good about how we're using our influence. Because we know, right? People can use influence for good and people can use influence for bad, right? We see leaders in the news using influence for bad. We can look at history and go, wow, they had a lot of influence and they used it in horrible, horrible ways. So it's each day showing up and saying, nope, this is how I'm going to show up. This is how I want to show up. And this is how I desire to show up.
Yes. Thank you. Since you've done some of the research and are talking with people constantly kind of about these EQ and IQ skills, anecdotally, do you see how these skills are also helpful in personal lives and parenting then as well? And maybe even in your own personal life, are there situations where it's been helpful to you?
Absolutely. 1000%. I think all of this, the bottom line is, right, it's about relationships and how do you strengthen relationships, right? So, you do the exercise and you're thinking about somebody who's influenced your life and help you go further, help you go faster, right? It's because you had a relationship with that person. Yeah, they might not have known it, right? Like Simon Sinek doesn't know that oftentimes I like to listen to him because it puts me in a good frame of mind and makes me optimistic because he's so optimistic, he's influencing me. I think about my children, I'm blessed with four kids at home, and how I can use the emotional intelligence piece to speak to them, right? As parents, we know that as much as we just want to be like, just do it my way and just do what I say, and it would just be easier. And in the workplace too, right? We're like, well, just do what I told you to do.
And do it
These are
now.
the steps you need to take. Yes. It's how do I recognize the emotional awareness that needs to go along with that and pivot the discussion or the dialogue to speak to that piece of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I think can be extremely powerful in those moments where you have the opportunity to pause. It does oftentimes take longer, right? To sit come at it from a place of respect, giving somebody time, creating, giving them awareness and grace, that it can take longer.
Right.
But it's worth the investment.
Yeah. And so really, I mean, so much of this is just relational skills, right? It doesn't matter whether it's someone that reports to you or works with you, or it's your partner or your child or your friend and family. So many of these, the self-awareness and being able to reflect and have some of those communication skills. And again, all of those are things that work with everyone and benefits you when you're able to recognize and show up that way and to reflect and give grace. I love that one too, that for yourself and for other people, because we're all humans. Even with the best intentions, it doesn't go exactly the way we want. Right.
Right. I think of one of my kids will say to me like, oh, I should do this. And in my head, I'm like, that's a stupid decision. Like that would not be the right choice. But instead of saying that, even though that might be the first thing that pops into my head, it's staying curious, right? That's how we can go from that lens of not using the IQ piece, but using the EQ piece, staying curious by asking questions.
Yes.
Well, why do you think that that's the best choice? Or why is that the decision that you want to make in this situation? So being very curious, because it helps you understand their logic, and then again, ask questions to potentially challenge that logic and to help them consider other variables that might be at play.
Right. I love curiosity. And I often talk with people that if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling judgmental, if you're frustrated, if you're angry, and sometimes even if you can just switch into curiosity to lessen that emotion and think of it not because you can't be curious and judgmental at the same time. It really, I'm not going to say it's definite, but it's pretty difficult to have those two at the same time. And so if you are more open about, what would they be thinking that would make sense? Or how did we get from here to there versus that's stupid? Or how could you think that? And certainly that is just another technique that is going to be helpful in whatever relationship or interaction that you're having, not to eliminate frustration or anger or judgment, because those will happen. But there's times too where people don't want to feel that, like it just comes up out of that immediate, more negative kind of emotion. Yeah.
So and when you create that habit of curiosity, right? If you can change that and create that habit, then it increases your influence, right? So you think about that influence and the impact of it. That is how you increase your influence, is by creating that from that place of curiosity and asking questions and developing that trust and respect and foundational rapport for that relationship.
Yeah, for sure. Good. So somebody's listening and we're talking about your emotional skills and we talked about kind of your awareness. What does that look like if I want to improve it, or I'm not sure where I'm at? Like if somebody's just listening today, what would you suggest for them in terms of gauging where they're at or how to improve?
I think there's a lot of really great resources depending upon what speaks to a person, right? So there's even emotional EQ assessments that you can take online, right? If you Google EQ assessment, you could take an assessment that would give you some self-awareness potentially. looking at some of the resources that maybe you've already been exposed to, right? So a lot of organizations do assessments, whether it's strength finders, PI, and the like. Tell us about ourselves. Other ways are in 360 reviews. If you have a 360 review or any other type of review that you've experienced along the way in the workplace, are great ways to dig a little bit deeper and look for those nuggets, as well as asking for feedback. In the Midwest, we have what we call Midwest nice.
Yes.
And, in fairness, like I'd rather be Midwest nice than some of the other, things that exist in other areas of the globe. I'll take Midwest nice. What happens though is sometimes we get very diluted feedback from leaders around us. And it creates, we all have blind spots. And sometimes we never know what those blind spots are because we're not asking. And potentially people are too gun shy to tell us, like, hey, do you know that you are so passionate? And this was one of mine. So I'm sharing one of my blind spots that a leader shared with me. She goes, you show up so passionate about what you're talking about that it can be intimidating to other people in the room to challenge what you're saying. I was like, oh, really? I had no idea. And I'm a very passionate person about what I speak about and, values based. And I go, oh, the important piece to me was that was never my intent.
Sure. And we would normally think of being passionate about a topic as a very good thing. And so accepting that feedback. Yeah. So what did you do with that feedback then?
So sometimes I'm a very visual person. I literally wrote out and pasted to my laptop, which oftentimes I had meetings. So I was working in an organization where we had many locations and we oftentimes were doing video meetings. And so I would type out and then tape to my laptop reminders for myself. Things like ask the questions, make sure that you're giving people feedback. So one of them that I guess it tag teamed with that is, so having worked in human resources for the length of time that I had, I've learned to hide my emotions in the sense of that when people are coming to me, right, you never know what's walking in the door or what you're going to pick a phone call up to. You never know what they might be asking of you. And so I've been very good at learning that people couldn't read my face, but that also freaked people out. And I didn't know it, right? They're like, we can't tell what you're thinking. And I'm like, well, I know, because I don't want you to know what I'm thinking right then. So learning that it's okay. So one of the things that I had printed out was, make sure I'm showing nonverbals, right? That is how we communicate more often than verbal communication. More things take place in our nonverbals. So are my nonverbals engaging and asking people to invite them into the conversation? So both verbally and non-verbally, how am I make sure I'm inviting people into the conversation?
As I'm sitting here nodding my head as you're talking, right? So perfect. Very good. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Sarah. Is there anything else that you would like to just share on this topic?
Again, thank you for the time today and being able to speak about this topic that I'm clearly passionate about and believe it is of such high value to every single person.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if you work in a workplace, if you are one of the amazing people who stays at home and makes sure that everything is moving and all the dials are moving in at home. There are so many opportunities to use our influence for good and recognize that when we're able to show up for somebody in a place that's meaningful, so coming from that emotional intelligence side, when we can show up for them, it is incredibly powerful. And so I guess I would just say, I'd love to give people continued encouragement on their journey, because we're all on a journey. We don't ever arrive. We've never all figured it out. So just encouraging them on their own journey as they increase self-awareness and harness this ability to really hone in on, where our blind spots might be and how we can show up for others.
Perfect. Thank you. And where can people learn more about you or find you if they would want to follow along or work with you?
Thank you so much. So again, my name is Sarah Fecht and I own Best Self Leadership. The best way right now to reach me is via LinkedIn. So if you reach out on LinkedIn, Sarah Fecht, you can also find me on Facebook. I am in the midst of revamping a website. So that will be live soon. It will be bestselfleadership.com, but it is not live yet as of November 2023. Hopefully it will be up live in 2024. So if you're listening to it then, hopefully you'll be able to find me there as well.
Okay. And I'll also put links in the show notes as well. So
thank you, Kristen.
Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen Odegaard. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.